Hello and welcome to another interview from my capstone, Shining a Light on Fanconi Anemia. I'm Alex and I'm here with Dr. Myers.
Hello.
Um, it is nice to be here with you.
Very nice to be here too.
Um, and my first question is, what's going on with you? Like, how is Cincinnati? How is your kid and everything like that?
We're doing well. It's cold here in Cincinnati. It's February and it's in the 20s, and we had 8 inches of snow yesterday. So we're a little cooped up, but otherwise doing well. And my son is back in school full time. So he's pretty thrilled to be doing that too.
I'm sure he's excited for that.
Yeah.
So my first actual question, I guess, is how long have you been a doctor?
Oh, I graduated from medical school in 2004. I finished my pediatric residency in 2007, and I finished my hemonc fellowship in 2010. And I've been doing bone marrow transplant ever since.
Okay. So since 2010, you've been doing bone marrow, so about 10 years now?
Yep.
Oh,
Yep.
wow.
Just a little over. Yeah.
And where did you go to med school?
I went to medical school at Case Western in Cleveland.
Ah, okay. I think I've heard them before. Um, how did you hear about Fanconi anemia?
Well, so, I started learning about FA when I first got to Cincinnati Children's as a resident. I rotated on the hematology and oncology service, and the transplant unit had some patients with FA. And because we have a lot of patients that come to Cincinnati for their care with FA, I got a lot more exposure than most pediatric residents do. And then
Mm,
I rotated as a resident also with Dr. Richard Harris, who was one of the founding members of the transplant unit in Cincinnati, and then worked with Dr. Stella Davies as well. So they kind of got me hooked, I would say. Yeah.
okay. That makes sense. So why'd you become a bone marrow transplant specialist and like specifically?
Yep. So bone marrow transplant appeals to me in a lot of different ways. It The problems are complex, but you get to follow your patients for a very long time, and for most patients, forever once they've had their transplant. um, so I love the continuity. I love getting to know my patients and sort of helping them through, a difficult process, but getting them to the point where they're like you, healthy and living their lives and feeling great.
Yeah. I can say that like having a doctor, like the same doctor throughout this whole experience has definitely been comforting. And it's been nice to really like for our families to kind of just have that connection with you. It just makes it like our trips to Cincinnati makes it so much easier knowing that like you're gonna be there and that you're a doctor because we already know you.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I think that's, having that relationship is one of the best parts of, that's why I went into medicine, is to get to know my patients and to sort of, have that long-term relationship where you get to watch everybody grow up and see the cool things that they do with their life. It's really great.
Yeah, that's pretty special. Can you explain the bone marrow transplant process in layman terms?
Sure. Yeah. You may or may not remember me talking about this with your family. But I usually use the analogy of gardening when I talk about transplant, because it makes it sort of a little more um, relatable.
Yeah.
So if you think about your bone marrow as the garden or the factory that produces your blood, right? And in a garden, there are different types of plants, and where you would have a vegetable garden that would make tomatoes or peppers or something like that. In your bone marrow garden, you make red blood cells to carry oxygen around, white blood cells to carry or to fight infection, and platelets to help you stop with your bleeding. And some people's gardens don't have enough plants, um, and they can't make enough blood. Some people's gardens have weeds in them, and that would be like a cancer. And so we need to clean out that garden and give new plants. And that's what we do with a bone marrow transplant. We give chemotherapy or sometimes radiation, but not always. And that kind of cleans out the plants from the garden and gets that garden ready to have new plants. And then we plant the seeds, which are the stem cells that come from the donor. And just like any other garden, you can't plant seeds and come back the next day and have a 3-foot tomato plant. You got to wait a little bit. So it takes about 2 to 3 weeks for the seeds to start to grow, and on average, a year to get a normal immune system.
Okay, because that makes sense. That's a lot. It's a lot easier of an explanation than anything else.
Yeah.
I was thinking because I know that it's different with everyone because I know that my isolation period was longer than my sister's.
Yep.
Why would that why was that? Like why would that be? Like why would there be like different periods, I guess?
So it depends on how quickly the immune system comes back. We're really, it's bone marrow transplant's a little different than if you think about like a solid organ transplant where you're putting a kidney in as a whole piece. We're actually growing the immune system from scratch. From those tiny stem cells. And so it takes time to recruit those, to grow those cells. I sort of talk about it like almost like the military, right? Like you have to recruit the different types of white blood cell soldiers that you have. You can't just have the Army, you have to have the Navy and the Air Force too, right? And then it also takes time to train those cells. And each person has that happen at a different pace. Some people faster, some people slower. And there are sometimes it's just unique to that particular combination of donor and patient, and you can't really predict that. And then there are treatment related things that can influence that, like how many stem cells you got in the beginning. Getting a bigger number often makes things develop faster. Or if you need extra therapies after the stem cells grow that would sort of slow that process down, then it can take longer for the new immune system to come back.
Oh, okay. That makes sense. Just different hosts provide different times of to recover. What are the most common diseases that are treated with bone marrow transplants?
So the most common worldwide would be cancer in general, and it depends. Pediatric transplant is a little different, where there's a little bit more leukemia and a few solid tumor transplants, whereas adult transplant is very heavy on some other cancers like multiple myeloma and things like that. But in pediatrics, we also treat non-malignant, is what we call them, or non-cancer diseases like Fanconi anemia. So examples of that would be people who have immune systems that are not normal, people with bone marrow failure syndromes like Fanconi anemia, where their bone marrow isn't producing blood appropriately, or also diseases like thalassemia, where the cells aren't being produced correctly, and so they don't function well. That thalassemia would be a disease where your red blood cells are not made correctly.
Okay. Which is the greatest improvement that you've seen in the bone marrow transplant process?
Right. So in the time I've been doing it, if you want to talk about Fanconi anemia specifically, I would say the biggest improvement is the removal of radiation from the transplant protocol, because that has a lot of long-term side effects and causes a lot of trouble in the short term and the long term. And so that's been a huge advance for patients with FA. In transplant in general, one of the biggest things that has come across in the last few years is cellular therapy, or training somebody's immune system to fight either infection or their cancer. And so that's sort of a new direction the field is going. We can now make white blood cells that will fight viruses for you. So we don't have to use as many toxic medicines to fight viruses after transplant, which has made a huge difference. And then there are ways to genetically modify the immune system to attack a leukemia. And that's sort of a really cool and new pathway forward for patients with leukemia.
Oh wow, that's it's crazy the advancements that have come with technology and how rapid it's become.
Oh yeah, it's constantly changing, and it's really fun to be a part of. Yeah.
I would imagine so. So obviously it's important to like be a donor. How can you like register to be a bone marrow donor?
Yeah, anyone who's interested, who's 18 or older, can register to be a donor at bethematch.com or .org. And the National Marrow Donor Program has a list. They'll send you a kit. You swab your cheek and send it in, and they'll put you on the registry. And then when we search for donors, we can put the patient's information in a computer database and search through millions of donors worldwide, actually, to identify the person that matches them best.
That's incredible.
Yeah, it's really neat.
So I know that so in my process, I had like a few months before I had to go to transplant because I was in like bone marrow failure. First was like Jacqueline, we knew that she was like slowly going down. So we knew like eventually she'd have to have a bone marrow transplant. Would like the altered like search times affect, I guess, like the result and like the like your donor? Like the match.
Right. So there's definitely different urgencies to finding a donor for people, like you said, right? Some people need it right away, and some people you have plenty of time. What's really most impactful, though, is the genetics of your typing. So when we type people, we're looking at little proteins on the outside of their cells that are like ID badges that say, this cell belongs to me. I'm okay to be here, right? And those are called HLA proteins. And some people have super common badges or HLA proteins, and some people have super rare ones. And so depending on how difficult your match is, it can really affect how long it takes to find a donor. For patients like Jacqueline, where we know that transplant is something that might be in the future, we always look sort of early on and say, hey, how hard do we think it's going to be? Because if we think it's going to be hard, we start early.
Okay. Was Jacqueline one of those, or is she more easily identifiable?
Jacqueline, I think, had a fairly easy search. Yeah.
That's good. Um, I know you probably have no idea, but I was wondering, like, an approximation of how many Fanconi anemia children you believe you've like done transplants for over your time.
Yeah. So I've probably transplanted somewhere between 20 and 30 patients with FA myself. Our hospital transplants on average somewhere between 10 to 15, sometimes a little more than that a year. So I've been part of about 150 FA transplants, I would say, since I joined Cincinnati Children's. But patients of my own is probably closer to 30. Yeah. And then I have many patients with FA that I care for that have not required a transplant.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess my last thing FA related is there anything else that you'd like to share? I don't have any other questions regarding that. But if there's anything I didn't cover, like Fanconi anemia related or bone marrow transplant related, like feel free to.
Um, I think the one thing that I would sort of mention is that the transplant helps fix the blood problems of Fanconi anemia, but some people have other issues with RFA, and the transplant doesn't really change those issues.
Yeah.
And so that's just something to keep in mind. And one of the reasons why we continue to follow our patients for many years, so that we can kind of keep an eye on the other issues that can pop up with time, and having those experienced eyes to know what to look for. Yeah.
That makes sense. So my next question is, I was wondering, and I've been wondering for a while now, who is your favorite between Jacqueline and me?
That is not a fair question. I have favorites. I love you both. You guys are both great in your own ways. Yeah.
Thank you. That's probably the best answer. Um, I was also wondering if, I know this was a long time ago, but if you remembered my favorite NFL team from way back when.
I don't. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Do you like the? I'm not gonna guess because I'll guess wrong, and then you're gonna. You don't like the Steelers, do you?
I do not, but they're close to the Steelers.
You're close to the Steelers.
I like the Philadelphia Eagles.
Oh, okay.
It's all right. I mean, my whole
That
like transplant was like themed after the Eagles, but
yes, that does sort of ring a bell now that you say that. Yeah.
yeah, it's all right. I I would not be able to remember that far back anyways. Yeah.
It's been a little bit of time since your transplant. Yeah.
It has, which is crazy. It doesn't feel like it's been that long.
No, it does not. Yeah, time flies.
And my last question is, would you ever be interested in coming to a fundraiser here in Virginia? As you know, we have the April one that is not going to be happening this year, but we also have the golf one in October. And we're just, me and my family, were wondering if you'd ever be willing to show up to one.
I think I can make that happen.
We hope so. That's for
Yeah.
sure. All
Yeah,
right.
just you keep me posted on the plans.
All right. I will do for sure. Thank you so much for talking with me, Dr. Myers. I appreciate this conversation so much. And thank you for anyone who's watching and tuning in and following my capstone throughout this entire process. I appreciate you so much. And thank you. Thank you again just for talking with me.